Welcome back to Base Bible. In order to embrace the somberness of the spirit of Lent, we have refrained from our usual levity. Don't worry, it'll be back soon. Another housekeeping item, there will not be episodes for Palm Sunday or Easter Sunday, as I'm sure that many of you, like myself, will have various church commitments. But we will have a little something special for Good Friday, as well as an episode for Holy Saturday, which is often a neglected day. So don't worry, we will not leave you completely orphaned during this important season of the church year. Our overall short lesson for the season of Lent has been: Lent is about fighting against temptation and God's plan of salvation to save us from sin. In looking at God's plan of salvation to save us from sin, we have looked at three covenants so far: the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and the Mosaic covenant. And in looking at these covenants, we have seen some tensions play out. So for instance, in the first two, the Noahic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant, they're both promissory covenants. That is, God takes the full initiative and the full responsibility for the promises being kept. Whereas for the Mosaic covenant, it's an obligatory covenant. Israel has a part to keep, and one that they often fail at. 2, we've also seen in these covenants how there are signs attached to these covenants. And while the signs are indicating something really good and wonderful, they use very gruesome symbols. So we have, the bow of war, or circumcision, or an animal sacrifice. Third and finally, we see that each of these covenants had a parallel in the Christian life. So Noah's flood was parallel with our baptism. Abraham's faith in the resurrection parallels our faith in the resurrection. But with the Mosaic covenant, we've seen a parallel with our need to obey and take up our cross with Christ. And the problem with this call for obedience is often we're not able to give it. Often we fall short, like the Israelites in the desert last week. In our second component of Lent, that is fighting against temptation, we have been journeying with Christ thus far as he's been battling temptations of Satan in the wilderness, in Peter, and in the temple. But as we've gone on this journey, we have known this entire time that this has been leading to the cross, which is the final confrontation of Christ against Satan. With this week, we are going to see how Christ, by keeping perfect obedience, not only defeats Satan once for all and defeats the problem of temptation once and for all, but fulfills God's plan of salvation by inaugurating a new covenant sealed by his perfect obedience. So in this new covenant, we both have God's promissory initiative of grace, in that God in the person of Christ does it all, but also the fulfilling of the obligatory covenants with perfect obedience. Furthermore, we're going to see how this covenant, while promising the greatest of joys and blessings to humankind ever given, also uses the most gruesome symbol that humankind has ever known: the cross. Finally, we are going to see how this salvation has continued in the church's offering of the Eucharist throughout the world. Beginning in 627 BCE until the Babylonian exile in 587 BCE, spanning a total of 5 different kings, Jeremiah's career as a prophet is one consistently of doom and gloom, as he prophesies the defeat of the southern kingdom of Judah at the hands of the Babylonian Empire. In fact, Jeremiah's message is so full of doom and gloom that he is suspected of colluding with the Babylonians to defeat the Judeans, and for this, he is actually thrown into prison. However, before the Babylonian exile, there is a major historical event for the southern kingdom of Judah that takes place that, funny enough, Jeremiah makes almost no mention of. And these are the reforms of King Josiah in 622 BCE. So King Josiah, who's one of the few righteous kings, he decides that he's going to renovate the temple. And in the midst of this renovation project, he discovers the Book of the Law. Perhaps this is the Book of Deuteronomy, perhaps this is some version of the Ten Commandments, but he's found the Book of the Law. And King Josiah, as he reads this and has it interpreted for him, he begins to realize how far the people of Judah have fallen away from obeying this law. And as a result, King Josiah decides that he's going to do a massive campaign of reforms to get rid of all the idolatry in the land and to reinstitute proper worship of Yahweh. So why does the prophet Jeremiah not mention this event? Well, Hedy Lehman, she suggests, I think quite correctly, that the reason that Jeremiah does not mention these reforms of King Josiah is simply that these reforms clearly don't stick. Because King Josiah's son, King Jehoahaz, see, try to pronounce that several times fast, okay? This king, he subsequently undoes all of King Josiah's work. So basically, the son is born, and he takes the kingdom, and he undoes everything his dad did. So these reforms don't stick. But for the prophet Jeremiah, there is an even deeper reason as to why the reforms of King Josiah did not stick than simple historical happenstance. The reason that they don't stick is because the hearts of the people themselves are unreformed. Now, it's important to understand that in Hebraic anthropology, the heart is not primarily a seat of emotions. So we normally think of heart as a place of emotions and sentiments. But for Hebrew anthropology, the heart is actually the seat of the will. It's actually what you choose into. It's what you decide at the end of the day, what you are going to do. Your volitional will is your heart, not your feelings about any particular thing. And Jeremiah, consistently throughout his prophetic career, has a lot of harsh words about the hearts of those in the southern kingdom of Judah. He says that their hearts are stubbornly fixed in their own habits, that they are insincere and manipulative, and worst of all, their hearts are deceitful and perverted. Indeed, one of the most famous verses in all of the book of the prophet Jeremiah is, "The heart is devious above all things. It is perverse. Who can understand it?" So this is the condemnation that Jeremiah chiefly has of the southern kingdom of Judah. Because for Jeremiah to simply have the law and to know what it says is actually not enough. Education is not the problem. Right? Societal ills cannot all be blamed on a lack of education or ignorance, because sometimes we know exactly what the right thing to do is, but there's a lack of will to actually do that right thing. So Jeremiah has recognized this. He's recognized that, okay, yes, we have the book of the law now, we know what it says, but clearly the people of Judah do not wish to follow it. And it is for this reason that when the prophet Jeremiah proclaims a new covenant, it is not a change of content. It is not a new law. Jeremiah does not think, oh, the problem is the Mosaic law. We need to have new laws. No, Jeremiah recognizes the problem is in the recipients of the law. As Donald E. Gowan in his book, The Theology of the Prophetic Books, notes, if there was to be any hope for a better future that would not be perverted immediately by human sinfulness, people themselves will have to be transformed. So, what Jeremiah clearly sees is that if the Mosaic covenant is going to stick, if the covenant that God makes with the people of Israel, that God's presence will abide with them and that they will be a kingdom of priests, if that is to have a permanent stance, then there must be some kind of complete, perfect obedience that arises from the hearts of those that are going to obey the law. They are going to have to want to obey the law. So, while the God of Israel could write new laws or whatever, no, the God of Israel has to forgive their disobedience of the law and give them a new heart that chooses willingly and joyfully to obey the law. Can you imagine doing the right thing because you want to, not because you've been pressured or guilted into it, right? To have no inner conflict between what you want and what the right thing to do is. What we see for Lent, then, is Jeremiah proclaiming to us of a God that intends to forgive sin and renew our hearts to become capable of free and joyous obedience. Psalm 119 is the longest of the Psalms in the Bible, spanning 176 verses. Now, if you remember our fourth week of Epiphany, in which we covered Psalm 111, we mentioned that that psalm was an acrostic used to help teach children the alphabet. Well, Psalm 119 is in some sense kind of the adult version of this, because Psalm 119 is also an acrostic. But unlike Psalm 111 that uses only one line for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Psalm 119 uses 8 lines for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it's clearly a lot more full and there's a lot more content going on in Psalm 119. Thankfully, our lectionary passage just covers the second letter of this acrostic, the letter Bet. Now, allow me to indulge in a fun little practice of my own, in which I try to emulate the Church Fathers in interpreting a passage. And one of the things that the Church Fathers often do is they look at particular problems in the text and then try to resolve those problems within the lens of Christian theology. So here are 2 particular problems with this text that people have pointed to. One, that the NET Full Note Study Bible notes, is that they translate verse 9 as a young person. But they know that literally the Hebrew says a young man. Okay? Secondly, the editors of the Jewish Study Bible, they note that it's kind of odd that the psalmist chooses the number 8 to group these verses in, as opposed to 7, which is a much more biblically symbolic number. So why does the psalmist choose 8 instead of 7 in order to group his lettering? Because clearly this is an intentional point. So, with regards to the first difficulty, why is it a young man? I mean, even St. Augustine in his homilies on the Psalms asked this question. Why is it a young man? Can it be a woman? Can't it be an older person? Why a young man in particular? Well, like we've done with previous Psalms, I think part of the solution is to actually read the Psalm from the perspective of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was, of course, a young man. And once you read this Psalm from that perspective, you see how fitting it is, because it's about someone who is perfectly obedient to the law, someone that totally obeys the law of God till the very end. And who was more perfect and obedient than Jesus Christ? Secondly, why this grouping of 8 verses as opposed to 7? As we know from the book of Genesis, God creates the world in 7 days. The 7 in the Hebrew Bible comes to be a very significant number, kind of signifying completeness, a complete set of something. So then, when the early church began to discern that God was renewing the covenant, was renewing the world, and had performed the resurrection on the Sunday, they recognized that God was both having to go back to the beginning, but also start anew, right? So the seventh day would have been the Saturday, and then the eighth day would have been the Sunday. But the Sunday would have also been the first day. So all of a sudden, in the early church, number 8 becomes very significant. It becomes the number for a new beginning, a new renewal. And I think somehow that Psalm 119 is prophetically speaking to this, that the reason it groups it in 8 verses for each letter is that it's actually speaking about the renewal of the covenant, the renewal of the law, a new beginning for fulfilling the law completely and wholly. To sum up then, with regards to our psalm, we can see that it both speaks to the need that Jeremiah had, that we must have the law of God on our hearts, as we can clearly see in verse 11, but also points us forward to the perfect obedience and the renewal of the covenant and the law that Jesus Christ makes. Our psalm then is inviting us to be like Jesus, to be praying for the desire to be obedient. Okay, what is a priest exactly? I think a present day modern analogy that we can use is like a doctor. A doctor is someone that's expert in medical science. They are entrusted with our bodies and they administer prescriptions for healing. And so likewise, priests are experts in the law of God. They are entrusted with the most valuable things of a society, including animals and money, and then they administer healing from the sacrifices of the society. So with that imperfect analogy, hopefully you can see just how important priests are. We need priests for our relationship to God in the way that we need doctors for our relationship to our bodies. Okay, this is how important priests are. So when we get to the Epistle to the Hebrews, and the Epistle to the Hebrews has a unique theology about Jesus being the high priest, we can see how important this claim might be. For the Epistle to the Hebrews, otherwise, is actually a huge enigma. We don't know who wrote it, we don't know when they wrote it, we don't know who they were writing to, or why. But it has this very unique theology that not only is Jesus the sacrifice and the medicine administered, but is himself the doctor. And this is very, very crucial during the first century. For during the first century, which is the era in which the New Testament was written, the Levitical priesthood, that is the priesthood that God installed from the lineage of Moses' brother Aaron, that God himself appointed. This institution in the first century was basically shot. Okay? So just before our passage in Hebrews, toward the end of chapter 4, we have the author of Hebrews saying that, God is the one that appoints priests, that priests do not take the office for themselves, that God is the one that appoints priests. But the problem is, by the time of the first century, we kind of have a deep sense that the priests are chosen based upon nepotism or money. And we know this because in the mid-2nd century BCE, during the course of the Maccabean revolt, we have seen that various rulers of various empires choose to install their own high priests. Okay? So no longer is the high priesthood based upon lineage or descent from Aaron, but it is based upon political appointment, essentially. So then you eventually get rulers like King Herod or the Roman governor choosing whoever they want to be high priest. And the people kind of look at this and they're like, I don't know if that's really legitimate. And if you don't have a legitimate priesthood, then your access to God and to the most important things of your society is severely limited, right? Think of it like if someone was able to print off a medical doctorate off the internet and suddenly you can't trust who is a doctor and who isn't. There is some illegitimacy in the institutions of medicine, right? If you have that illegitimacy, you have a really big problem because now your access to public health is diminished greatly, okay? So what begins to happen in the first century is many Judeans begin to yearn for a renewed priesthood that is based upon God's appointment once again. And we see many Judeans begin to look to an obscure figure in the book of Genesis known as Melchizedek. So, for instance, we see groups like those that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls begin to look to Melchizedek as a messianic figure that would come, atone for Israel's sins, defeat Satan, and act as Yahweh's messianic representative on earth to renew the priesthood. So why are Judeans looking toward Melchizedek as a figure for a renewed priesthood? Well, Melchizedek in the book of Genesis is a king of the city of Jerusalem. He is a priest of the Most High God. So he's a legitimate king and he's a legitimate priest. And all of this is before the Levitical priesthood. So it is a priesthood that is prior to the previous Levitical priesthood that first century Israel has now lost. Secondly, Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and he gives him a blessing of bread and wine. Then lastly, in Psalms like Psalm 110, we could see that there were expectations that the new Davidic Messiah that was to come would also be of the priestly order of Melchizedek. Okay, so you have this huge expectation that the priesthood's going to be renewed in the Melchizedek order, which guarantees its legitimacy. And the reason that I've spent so much time digging into this concept is because for Hebrews, this is the central idea, is that Jesus' priesthood is legitimate and fulfilled. And if it is so, then our access to God is guaranteed, living, and true. When Jesus prays for us, he is heard. When Jesus speaks on God, we better listen. When Jesus is acting on our behalf, it is effective. When Jesus offers himself in the bread and wine of the Eucharist and giving us the gifts of his sacrifice, they are legitimate healings for our souls. Our lesson for Lent is very clear. We are to trust in the priesthood of Jesus for our access to God. Our gospel passage clearly depicts the truth of our epistle, for Christ learns obedience, perfectly obeys by going to the cross, and thus guarantees our salvation by his perfect obedience. We can see that Christ has the law of God written on his heart as he desires to obey the law. We see that God fulfills the petitions of our psalmist by not letting Christ stray from the commandments. And we could see that Christ, by his perfect obedience in what he was asked to do, guarantees to us access to the presence of God as stipulated in the Mosaic covenant. And in verses 20 and 21, we can already see here a precursor of Christ drawing all people to himself with the arrival of these Greeks who wished to see Jesus. Jeremiah said, "And they shall all know me." These Greeks say with our psalm, "Teach me thy statutes." Finally, we can see that God is heeding Jesus here as a priest, as Jesus lifts up tears and supplications for them. And God answers in the thunder like he did with Moses on Mount Sinai and given the original law, and showing this to the Greeks there that yes, God will be glorified by Christ's death on the cross. Now, some people might be troubled by the idea that Jesus ever struggled to obey, that Jesus ever had a fight within himself to obey, that there was ever any conflict. Because the idea is, well, he's God incarnate, so doesn't he just do it? Why the struggle? And we assume, like many Greek philosophers might have, that God would have been completely untouched by the fluctuations of human emotion that could have gone each and every way. Well, our friend St. Cyril of Alexandria, the 5th century church father, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, makes this note about how Christ taking on our human nature is conducive to our salvation. This is what St. Cyril of Alexandria writes. If he had not been afraid, our nature would not have been freed from fear. If he had not been grieved, there could never have been any deliverance from grief. If he had not been troubled and alarmed, there would have been no escape from these conditions. For every human experience, you will find the same corresponding experience in Christ. The passions of his flesh are stirred up, however, not to overcome him as they do us, but so that once they are stirred up, they may be destroyed by the power of the Word who dwells in the flesh, transforming our nature to a better condition. What Christ is doing then, by undergoing such horrific suffering on the cross, at every moment submitting his human will to the divine will, is completing obedience against the fearful temptations of Satan. And thus, when Jesus perfectly obeys, he casts out Satan because he has fought all of Satan's temptations by going to the cross, and secures our access to God and draws us to himself as the high priest. Our lesson for Lent then is very clear: to follow Christ to the cross, for there he has won the battle against Satan and his temptations. Well, that is us here for this week, for the 5th week of Lent at Base Bible. Once again, our short lesson for the overall season of Lent is: Lent is about fighting against temptation and God's plan of salvation to save us from sin. For our 5th week of Lent, we've seen Christ fulfill the Mosaic law, be perfectly obedient in the way that the Israelites and we are not able to. And in giving this perfect obedience on the cross, guarantees our access to God by being a perfect high priest for us in the following ways. God intends to forgive sin and renew our hearts to become capable of obedience. We are to pray for the desire to be obedient. We are to trust the priesthood of Jesus. We are to follow Christ to the cross, for he has already won the battle against temptation. Once again, thank you for watching here this week. Another housekeeping note: we will not have an episode for Palm Sunday or Easter Sunday. I'm sure that many of you will have church commitments like I do, but don't worry, we will not leave you orphaned. We will have a little special something for Good Friday, as well as a full episode for Holy Saturday, which is often a neglected date. Once again, thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and please consider becoming a Patreon member, especially if you have Lenten giving to do and you want to give to some ministry causes that you think are worthy of it. Please consider becoming a Patreon member here at Base Bible so we can continue our work. Once again, we will see you here next time for Holy Saturday for our next full episode. Blessings to you.